It's really nice to be here. My name is Carlos Ramirez Moreno, and today we are gonna talk about bisexual characters in video games. This presentation summarizes the results of a recent research that seeks to better understand how bisexuality is portrayed in video games. I consider this still a work in progress, and I hope to continue working along these lines in the future. So I welcome any feedback that will help to improve it, of course. The motivation behind this research is that bisexuality has been recognized by several authors as an orientation made invisible and largely unknown to most of society. One of the first authors to warn of this exclusion was Professor Kenji Yoshino, and the main reason given by the author was society's interest in stabilizing sexual orientation through what he called the symbolic erosion of plurisexuality. Plurisexuality is commonly seen as a threat to the social order and is therefore rejected from many sides. But this is not the only reason why bisexuality is the great unknown of orientations, because several authors have pointed to the impossibility of achieving true bisexuality, as it is usually an orientation that lacks clear signifiers to be expressed. These authors suggest that society expects bisexuals to eventually recognize their hidden monosexual identity and accept that they are confused or maybe going through a phase of experimentation. The expectation, therefore, is that bisexuals will recognize that they are either confused straight people, something that is more common in women, or repressed gay people, which is something more common in men. This research stems from the question of how video games represent bisexuality and whether the main stereotypes used for this purpose can be categorized. It's important to note that when we talk about stereotypes, we don't necessarily mean it in a negative sense. We understand stereotypes as a mental shorthand, which helps to convey ideas and images quickly and clearly. Although it's clear, it's obvious that it's impossible not to take into account the power relations underlying them. The research was conducted using a combination of conventional and directed content analysis, and theoretical premises were used as a starting point, and then a sample was analyzed to categorize the results. In order to work with an unbiased sample, I used a database of 98 game characters already labeled as bisexual. So the following is a summary of the results. The first of the topics, the most common topics associated with bisexuality is ambiguity. Several authors have highlighted the importance of the so-called bisexual chick, a popular trend among some artists of the 70s that continues today as a form of measuring sexual fluidity, especially among young people. The representation of this fluidity has cultivated an image of bisexuality as a decision that can be made at any time rather than a stable identity. This trait also entails the consolidation of bisexuals as people who have fun playing with their orientation, and this can be seen especially in Japanese video games, where bisexuality is rarely made explicit and is played in an ambiguous way, sometimes as a comic relief for the action. Let's think about the character Bart Klauser in Final Fantasy V, who feels attracted to his partner Faris shortly before discovering that he is a woman in disguise. Other characters who have fallen into this stereotype are, for example, Celos from Tales of Symphonia, Yusuke Kitagawa from Persona 5, or Vamp from Metal Gear Solid 2. Also, the introduction of transgender and genderqueer characters has been another of the strategies of Japanese games to present bisexuality in a subtle way. Although this representation is a positive sign of sexual fluidity, it implies a false relation between sexual orientation and gender performance, something that particularly affects the bisexual community. The second most common trait we found is infidelity and promiscuity. Various authors have agreed to point out the stigma that surrounds bisexuals as promiscuous, irresponsible, and untrustworthy. This promiscuity usually appears together with the confusion and lack of maturity with which bisexual people tend to be associated, incapable of, for example, committing to a monogamous relationship. Although less frequent than in other media, video games have also used this feature to introduce bisexual characters. One of the most prominent cases is River, antagonist and villain in Fable 2 and 3. And here, bisexuality, far from being significant for the plot, is used to emphasize the libertine personality of the character, who seems designed in the image and likeness of the iconic Lord Byron. Other bisexual characters, although not explicitly represented as promiscuous, allow a reading in this sense. An interesting case is that of Rachel Amber from Life is Strange Before the Storm. She is insinuated in the game as secretive, enigmatic, and even manipulative with her friend. And she somehow recalls the mysterious Laura Palmer from Twin Peaks, a series with which Life is Strange maintains a discursive relationship. In third place, hypersexuality has been recognized as another of the common stereotypes of bisexual people. This has generated an image of the bisexual as an individual who engages in all sorts of sexual practices. In this sense, the male gaze has resignified much of this representation, favoring sexual encounters among women so that the straight man can participate while preserving his masculinity. In Fear Effect 2, for example, the female character Hannah, who in the previous game establishes a relationship with a male mercenary, now appears involved with a female hacker, implying her bisexuality. Although the relationship wasn't shown explicitly in the game, the advertising left little room for interpretation, falling into the fetishization of the couple. Sometimes, as well, the perversion associated with bisexuals has led to sadism, especially among villains. In examples like Volgin from Metal Gear Solid 3, Melina from Mortal Kombat 11, or Morin from Mass Effect 2, bisexuality is used to highlight the corruption of the characters. Finally, bisexuality has also served to highlight the deviant and perverse nature of certain characters. This image has been used extensively in cinema, especially in films from the 80s, such as David Lynch's Blue Velvet and Mike's Murder. This trait raises the promiscuity and perversion we have seen before to enter the field of mental illness, a stereotype that is more frequent than it seems in video games. For example, Rockstar has introduced several bisexual characters marked by sociopathy. For example, Eddie Lowe from Grand Theft Auto 4, an NPC that appears in random encounters and is described as a serial rapist and murderer who was sexually abused as a child. Or Trevor Phillips from Grand Theft Auto 5, a sociopath also victim of abuse, who finds pleasure in any sexual practice, the kinkier the better. One of the earliest examples of a bisexual protagonist, Curtis from Phantasmagoria, Apostle of Flesh, captures the frequency with which fiction has treated bisexuals as people with traumatic pasts that have deviated them from the good path of monosexuality. Recently, however, some games have addressed this kind of disorder from a more emotional point of view. What Remains of Edith Finch and Night in the Woods have sensitively addressed the high levels of depression, anxiety, and suicidal behavior manifested in bisexuals. Mental health issues are present in these games, but in a natural way that helps normalize diversity rather than using it to capture players' interest. So the analysis conducted allows us to draw a series of conclusions, as well as raise new questions for future research. First, that bisexuality tends to be more implicit in Japanese games and more explicit in Western ones. Bisexuality from the Japanese point of view appears more linked to other traits such as femininity and cross-dressing, and often serves as a comic relief for the action and for the plot. By contrast, bisexuality is treated more seriously in Western games, with some cases where the topic is even addressed in a more mature way than usual, as in What Remains of Edith Finch and Night in the Woods. Overall, the analysis suggests that bisexuality is treated somewhat better in video games than in other media, such as film and television, but this may be simply because it's a relatively younger medium, and the presence of explicit bisexual characters in video games is still low, so we should wait for higher representation to get better results. We must insist on the question of explicitness because in many cases, bisexuality is confused with the freedom of players to engage in romantic or sexual relationships with another NPCs of any gender, the so-called gay button. This player sexuality has become a shortcut to introduce bisexuality without really taking sides for it. Although it favors fluid sexuality controlled by the player, it also erodes the stability of disputed identities, which would benefit from an explicit representation free of any interpretation. It's also urgent to broaden the focus from the text to context analysis and work from the point of view of reception, engaging in conversation with players to better understand the meaning that these representations have for them. And that's all. Thank you very much for your attention.